good day to those of you listening or watching on YouTube. And another good morning to those of you who are here with me and anybody who might be watching on the live stream. It's a great privilege for me always to be the presider at the Caron Chapel service, but each day is unique. And today we have the alignment of a series of topics with an occasion. And so it happens to be for YouTube folks, not only Mother's Day, but the Sunday and the sequence of topics in which the subject of humility comes across my radar. And I'm really good at that subject, by the way. As a person who went from atheist to pastor, one of the Sundays I preferred not to preach was Mother's Day. And that's because in my development as a human being, I've had quite an arc of, this makes it seem like it's well behaved, but in any case, there was quite a lot of movement for me in my relationship to this holiday and my experience as a child of a family of 5, grandchild, and now stepdad and step-grandfather. So I'm super excited, actually, oddly, to have a chance to address it sort of in a redemptive way, and yet not without sensitivity to those for whom you may be in a place where I have been, where the holiday rankles in one or more ways. My mom, when I was a child, was everything to me. I thought she was the most fabulous mother in the universe. I was the 4th of 5 children, and in my little eyes, my mom could do no wrong. She was the hero of my family. My dad was often away traveling, and my mom fed a tribe, basically, pretty much every night. And the rule at my house was if you had friends over, they were staying for dinner. And most of us did have friends over a ton because everybody in the neighborhood knew Jack's mom cooked like nobody else. And food was, in a certain sense, the centerpiece of the expression of love to some degree in our family. That's not to say my mom was unloving. She was very, very loving. She was incredibly creative. I knew that she was a poet. I knew that and she really managed the household. And my dad was like almost like an occasional visitor. I loved my dad too. But I didn't see any of the humanity or imperfection really in those early years. And I think that's the way it's supposed to be, and I'm very grateful that I got to have that. I got to have years where I just thought my mom was the best thing in the universe. And it's not that ever entirely went away, but it became much more complicated as life went on. And I was lamenting just yesterday. I went with my wife yesterday, now my second marriage, to visit the grave side of my mom. And one of the things I shared with my wife Judy was how many times, as I think back, and I don't have an exact record of a lot of years I don't remember very well, but what I'm absolutely sure of is that I'm sure there were Mother's Day where I barely communicated with her, and I feel shame about not having remembered in my young adult years what I must have meant to her and held on to what she meant to me. So and that was not by any means the worst of it. So continue to take forward, I came into my addiction recovery, and I remember there was a guy who I took a tremendous amount from, and there was a period of time in which the AA community was a surrogate family for me, and to some extent still is. But I really relied on the AA community for family, and on Thanksgiving, I would make sure I would make it to my home group, and my loved ones would be like, really, you're going to go to a meeting today? And I was like, yeah. And then when I would get there, I would feel that feeling that I think now I feel when I'm at home on holidays. But at that time, it was transplanted or substituted in this community of people seeking to be in recovery and love one another in a particularly generous way. So, Breck. So the story is, there was this fellow named Breck. He was a tremendous influence on me. He's now passed away. Long sobriety, wisdom, and kindness. And I remember hearing Breck say once in a meeting when I was a young buck in recovery that he had had an arc in terms of his view of how his family of origin persons were. but that as far as he was concerned today, all he felt about his parents was gratitude. And I remember thinking, I'll never get there. But here I am now. I've got a lot of gifts of time without a drink and drug. And I can tell you that this morning I am filled with gratitude for what my parents made possible for me. And I'd like to believe that they can hear and sense my gratitude. I joked about humility, but humility also is an arc thing for me. And I'd like to talk a little bit about humility and sobriety and those kind of things, and then eventually get back to the family piece. Not too long ago, which means maybe 6 or 8 years ago, I became credentialed as a facilitator of a kind of recovery meeting that's called a SMART recovery meeting. And I don't know if any of you have heard about SMART or know much about it, but I'm a SMART facilitator. And I even like the sound of it, right? And but I will confess, the reason I sought the certification was out of a sense of ethical responsibility in the work that I do with clients here, to make sure that I could intelligibly let clients know about the options that they would have as they matriculate past current care to get mutual support. Because the evidence shows that it's not whether but which. In other words, that a person finishing 28 or 31 days of primary care and addictions treatment is at great risk if they don't plan to attend some sort of communal group thing. And that as it turns out, there are several options on the menu card of those kinds of things. It's almost like at one time there was just aspirin, and now there's Tylenol and ibuprofen and those kinds of things. Or at one time there was only Prozac, and now there's a variety of other sort of medications for depression. And I think that's probably true of chemotherapies and all sorts of stuff. So this is a medical environment, and we're helping people awaken to a diagnosis. And then they have courses of treatment ahead for them, and they can make a choice. This is an instance in which the patient can make an intelligent choice about which regimen to adopt. But you should never forego a mutual support component. And it may be that medication can help, and maybe that organized formal therapy can help. Those are both also things you should be checking into. And but people who have decided to do medication alone or therapy alone or medication and therapy alone without mutual support have had worse outcomes, very documented, than people who have done even mutual support alone, weirdly. So the mutual support thing is a don't skip kind of thing. And yet, in 1935, mutual support came on the landscape of the human experience as an option to help people who suffered from addictive disorders. And so it's the earliest, it's the aspirin, it's the Prozac, it's the progenitor of a movement. And yet today, we know it's not the only option. And one of the other options out there is SMART, which appeals to people who think that they're like really intellectually driven and want an intelligent solution. I've invented an adjective to describe the difference between SMART and other options out there. The adjective I use is sciencey. I think SMART is a sciencey approach to mutual support. And so there are people who are sciencey. What happened when SMART originated, sorry to be so didactic at the moment, but that's sort of how I roll sometimes, but in 1994, when SMART entered the landscape of choices, so more than about 60 years after the 12-step thing was out there, it was able to make the claim that it was evidence-based as opposed to other choices. Although recently, in the last few years, there's been highly persuasive evidence that the 12 steps also produce clinical outcomes. So now, Smart Recovery cannot say we're evidence-based and the others are not. All of the options that are out there can say they're evidence-based. That's all the ones that I know of. I wouldn't go, to some weird, alfalfa tribe in, South Africa that, we do alfalfa smoothies and stay sober with each other. And I don't know if there is one, but I'm just saying, like Smart Recovery, Recovery Dharma, Alcoholics Anonymous, and all the various A fellowships all can claim that they're evidence-based. And so the distinctive of the SMART movement is that it is sciencey. But that still appeals to people. So I'd like to just let you know, and this has to do eventually with humility and then with all this stuff. I'll get it back, I promise. And so one polarity. There's a sciencey approach to mutual support, and that the other polarity, what has always been sort of thrown at the 12-step community, but also proclaimed by it as one of its distinctives, is spirituality as its center. And so SMART says it's not anti-religious, but it's a-religious and a-spiritual in terms of what work you'll do and what you'll sort of align to adopt. And the 12 steps are like, no, we're all about spirituality. And also, if you look at the SMART acronym and its opening mission statement, the word empowerment is in the mission statement, and self-management is in the acronym. SM of the SMART is self-management and recovery training. And so over here, you're like, you can do this, you can do this. And over here on the 12-step side, it's like, dude, your best thinking got you here. So why do you think you've got this like capacity to figure this out and master this thing? So there is a real seeming tension between the two movements in terms of what they foreground. And in the one side, you have the foregrounding of powerlessness and the aid of a power beyond ourselves. And then in the other, you have this idea that you can learn and master techniques that will help you in the thing. But like many dichotomies, I'm going to argue that there's a certain falsehood to the dichotomy. I really do have an objective here. But so here's what I want to say. This is a punchline. I'll try to be as brief as I can. That if you become adept at SMART, you turn yourself over to its methods. So there's a surrender to the SMART method. And there's a abdication of personal autonomy to some degree because now you're adopting things that you've learned here. And if you become a very devoted and avid 12-stepper, you still have to decide to rely on its tools. And so, in other words, it's not all, it's like some like people who are like, I'm conservative, I'm liberal. And like, but except I'm conservative on this thing and I'm liberal on that thing. And all of a sudden we realize that we like frequently demonize people who at the surface seem to hold stances that seem opposite to us, when in fact, life is just messier and muddier and grayer than it is black and white. And, I think we're beginning to come into some social consciousness of this. Many things that we thought were clear binaries are really not. So, when wisdom comes on the scene with regards to these kinds of polarities and debates, faith and agnosticism or atheism, and conservative versus liberal, or empowerment versus powerlessness, or all these things, it turns out that there's a place to be in the middle and to be gently welcoming to the understanding that both of the voices in the extreme have something to say, to inform where the person who is going to make progress going forward goes. If you absolutely believe that in the end powerlessness is the only solution, I think you would just give up and drink yourself to death. There is power that comes along. I'm going to have somebody who's going to celebrate 15 years of sobriety here in a couple of minutes. So, and people will say to her, "I'm so proud of you," and she will probably say, "Oh, it's the program or whatever." Okay, I get it. And that's what I say when people say, "Oh my gosh, 34 years." But I also, there's a point at which my wife says, take the compliment, Jack, and just say thank you. So because I am proud of having not had to drink for that long. And so there's a piece of self-management, and there's a piece of surrender, and there's a piece of faith, and there's all that sort of stuff. So anyway, wisdom seeks not so much to be in the extremes, but to some degree in the middle. And I've come to believe that to some degree that's what humility involves or requires. Not that I'm an expert on humility, because of course I'm not supposed to proclaim such a thing, but I do think that life is complicated. And that I remember hearing in AA people used to say, the more I know, the less I realize I know. And that sounds paradoxical, but to me there's a deep truth in it. The more I study, the wiser the horizons that I realize I've not explored loom in front of me. And in fact, in my privileged opportunity to study theology in a variety of different contexts, one of the things I wrote in 2010 in a journal was how profoundly I felt moved to silence. And that I was really, I got to go, hey, let me tell you about this, let me tell you about that, let me and you need to understand this, you need to understand that, and all of a sudden I'm like, And I started realizing that other people were doing what I was doing, and I had no patience for it whatsoever. And so, here I am doing it, by the way. And at a certain moment in my sobriety, I was all about the flawedness of my family system, and my mom's weaknesses, and my dad's weaknesses, and my oldest brother's role in bringing a lot of pain into a lot of people's lives. And I just saw the cracks in the vase of it all. And to me, it looked like a shattered piece of pottery at that period of time. I could go to a holiday event with the family, the official family, but even we were at certain times, we would have Thanksgiving in a restaurant, which if you do that, God bless you, good for you. And if you love that, good for you. But I don't. I want the turkey and mashed potatoes from Mom's kitchen, and I want certain recipes and those kind of things. And all of a sudden, it's as if the family had broken so far that it couldn't constitute an occasion like that. And I would preach in the church in which I was serving, which is funny. I'd gone from atheist to person of congregational leadership. I would talk about the refuge I was finding in God and in recovery, because the nest that I thought was safe, I saw as unsafe and insufficient and no longer coherent. And I was pretty judgy about it. I was ready to tell you what was wrong with my dad, what was wrong with my mom, and I had these signature stories. So I'll tell you one about my dad, because it's Mom's Day, and I'm not going to do this to my mom. But so I was working on something, I was applying for something, it was maybe a college application or whatever, and my dad was an English professor, and I gave him an essay that I'd written. And darned if he didn't get out the red pen, which is sort of what I asked him to do anyway. But I went, and I was like, okay, Dad, did you look at it? And when he pulled it out, he had crossed out the entire first page, which was a really tough ego blow for me, the great me. And here I am, what is this now, 35 years later, I'm holding him accountable for it. And I never got a chance to sort of do that. He died in 1982, so longer than that. But and I have taken him to task for that. It seemed to me so insensitive, but it was what I asked. So life is complicated, right? And I sort of did the same thing to my granddaughter last night. She was trying to play something on the piano, and 5 minutes later I played it, and I was like, "Oh, thanks a lot, Jack." So this stuff is hard, and one of the people who really influenced me in the subject area of parenting and humility and life and spirituality was a guy that I met in England. His first name is Noel, and Noel's a psychologist. And I think we were talking about adult children of alcoholic family systems and how difficult they are, and my own perfectionism and the striving that I have manifested in so much of my life. And he told me about a psychological theoretician named Winnicott. And I don't know if anybody know Winnicott, but I feel like we should spend more time talking about Winnicott. And it's too bad that Winnicott wasn't around to get on Oprah, because his message was really, really good. His construct was of the good enough mother. And his notion was, first of all, that we were hurting ourselves by painting this picture of attainment of right parenting. And that a dad or a mom needed to measure themselves against this, pedestal standard of the person who gets it right and knows how to criticize and encourage and knows how to rear and let go and knows how to fledge and retain and all of those sort of dichotomies of parenting, which make parenting so perilously difficult if you have this notion that you have to do it right. And Winnicott was like, let's stop that. Let's talk about being good enough. And good enough is great, because being not good enough is not great. And there are those of us who have had not good enough and suffered miserably, and I will tell you, a bunch of the people with the wristband here probably, to some degree, have something to look at in terms of their own personal, the parenting that they offer to their kids, and the parenting that they've experienced, because this is a hand-me-down thing, right? And so my experience is that a current generation that has some toxic family dynamics doesn't come by it doesn't invent it. It acquires it from the parenting of the generation before. And interestingly, really good news is that recovery can be transmitted as well. So I've known families that have made the turn from handing on really not great stuff to handing on really great stuff. And I need to finish, but I know where I was going to go. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk about pretty good and good enough as more than good enough. And to acknowledge that I participate, and most of us have participated in criticism of one another and of the systems of which we're a part against standards that no system can be expected to hold up to. We're ready to take down the family because it wasn't perfect. We're ready to take down the government because it's not perfect. We're ready to take down the church because it's not perfect. We're ready to take down the treatment center because it's not perfect. We're ready to take down the treatment team. Oh, my counselor is like, no, you only see me once a week, And then, when you talk to Caron alumni, they're like, the best thing was small, was like the lunchroom, And so it's good enough is great, by the way, against not good enough. And my predecessor in this role, the great Father Bill Hultberg, was a very imperfect dude. And I swear people saw him in this unbelievably rosy light, but I got to see the sausage making behind the, behind the skin, and I loved him all the more for it, and I hope you would too. But one of his favorite things was to tell a story about a young man who had come to Caron. He was one of the first patients that he'd worked with who had turned out to be HIV positive, a guy named Michael. It's a whole long story. And the path from Michael's awakening to faith and redemption and sobriety and all that sort of stuff involved Michael adopting a formula, meaning a spoken thing that he would say. And then Father Bill encouraged Michael to go say it first to himself in a mirror, then to a small group, then to the community meeting, and then, God forbid, to the chapel experience. And in this case, Michael's formula had some things that yours probably wouldn't, but it was, my name is Michael, I'm an alcoholic, I'm gay, I'm HIV positive. Those were his imperfections as he saw them, as the great reasons why everybody would see him as defective and insufficient in the role of a human being. And then he was to finish that confession with a question. Will you love me just as I am and not as I think I should be? And what Michael experienced in asking himself that question and in asking his peer community that question and then in asking the larger milieu and then the entire patient, family, alumni community that question is love. Not love of some avatar Facebook stream that he didn't even have at that time because there was not such a thing. But we all have these sort of imagined personas, this TV kind of thing. But love that accepted Michael as a person whose journey didn't involve stellar performance on this benchmark or that benchmark, but in fact, as it turns out, because at least he was alive and here in treatment, was good enough, or could become good enough. And this is my plea, is that each of us would find hospitality to one another into the present moment on that standard. Will you love you as you are and not as you think you're supposed to be? Can we love, and one of the things I tried to not do today is talk about this as if every mom here feels great about their mothering, or as if every person who wanted to be a mom has been able to be a mom, or as if every person who, the mother subject is a very complicated one for a group of people. There's a lovely prayer that I found, which will be read here shortly, that touches the various bases of how complex this landscape of subject matter can be. But if wherever you are, everybody had a mom, and many of us get to be around people who exhibit the maternal characteristics in beautiful ways. But can we drop the measure everybody against the unattainable and start to hold one another and cherish one another as who we are, not as who other people say we're supposed to be? I think that would really be a game changer in treatment, in recovery, and out there in the world. I love you as you are. I pray that you would hold me in the same esteem.